Chapter 15. Despite the short debacle over who in fact held the number one position on my speed dial, the rest of my evening with Megan was surprisingly pleasant, with no bursts of jealousy on my part that had marred our other recent encounters. It helped that Quentin's name never came up. The only interruption during the evening was the quick phone call I made to Deirdre to report our near-violent encounter at the movie theater. The call confirmed Mrs. Tyler James' assertion that the police had denied her access to Tyler's apartment, and I also learned that they had rejected her request to claim his body from the morgue. Deirdre, being surprisingly chatty, went on to explain that Minnesota doesn't recognize common-law marriages, which put Mrs. James' dubious claims on even weaker footing. After scrounging through Megan's remarkably sparse refrigerator and larder, I cobbled together a decent spaghetti sauce, pasta, and salad. Both were exponentially improved by 1.5 bottles of red wine. I noted that Megan's wine rack was clearly not suffering from the same lack of attention she paid to the pantry. "You certainly were brave tonight," Megan said out of the blue during a short lull in the conversation while I opened the second bottle of wine. "I mean, facing down those two creeps. And you didn't even know Tracy had gone to get a baseball bat, did you?" I shook my head, smiled smugly as one does when one has demonstrated meritorious bravery. "What choice did I have, really?" I said, refilling her glass and topping off mine. "I considered shirking, but how would that look? I mean, come on. I'm no shirker." "You don't shirk," Megan agreed. "And as a basketball player, Tracy has a lot more experience in scuffles and such. I couldn't be shown up by a mere girl." "At over 6 feet, there's nothing mere about that girl," Megan said as she sipped. "Hey, did I mention how horrible customers were today?" "You might have said something in passing," I said as I slid back into my chair. "But I never get tired of hearing about horrible New Age customers and their petty, self-righteous, but environmentally friendly needs." That was all the push she needed. I sat back, sipped my wine, and smiled as she recounted multiple examples of their innate horribleness. The next morning, I knocked lightly on Harry's door on the way up to my apartment in order to join him in our daily breakfast ritual. However, when he didn't appear after repeated knocking, I hit the number 1 on my speed dial, making a mental note to move Megan to that slot as soon as possible. Harry answered on the 3rd ring, and the tiredness in his voice gave me my answer before I even raised the question. "Thanks, Eli," he said quietly, "but I'm beat. I think I'm going to sleep in for another hour. Are you okay to get breakfast on your own?" I assured him I was. I started to head up to my apartment, but on the spur of the moment, I decided to head over to the coffee shop on the other side of 48th Street. A change of locale for breakfast would do me good, I decided, and since I was already bundled up for the cold, it felt like the notion had been almost predestined. 5 minutes later, I was sipping coffee and biting into a warm, flaky croissant with a chocolate center. I flipped open my iPad and was deeply engrossed in an article in Genie magazine about the pros and cons of the Erdnase bottom deal when my cell phone buzzed. I noted it was 9:01 and then answered the phone. "You're at work early." "The early bird has got nothing on me," said the far too chipper voice of my agent, Elaine. "I'm calling with a last-minute gig for tonight. You interested? Available?" I was both, but my primary reaction was one of tempered wariness. I hadn't heard from the elusive Mr. Lime in several days, and this sort of last-minute gig scenario was his favorite gambit as a setup for his patented creepy one-on-one meetings. "Probably," I said non-committally. "Is this a client you've worked with in the past, or is this a one-off?" "Oh, this is a meeting planner I've known for years. A bit flighty, not great with details, a bit of a lush, and a complete clothes horse, but a real sweetheart," she said in what could have been a perfect self-assessment if she had been so inclined. "Seems she got the call at 0:30 this morning from up on high that the one thing missing for her client's event tonight was some walk-around close-up magic. She called me, I called you, and here we are." Here we were indeed, I thought. With the client properly vetted, I quickly decided to accept the offer as my evening was open and, still stinging from Harry's recent criticism, I could always use the chance to polish my act to a level close to that of the almighty Quentin Moon. "Sure," I said. "Text me the details and I'll make you proud." "You always do. Now I've got to deal with the fallout from a recalcitrant and possibly inebriated piano player who got mad at a gig last night and played Piano Man for 2 hours straight," she said with a laugh. "What was his excuse?" "He claimed once you get into that song, there's no way out," she explained with another laugh. "To be honest, he might have a point." "We lead weird lives," I said. "We do indeed," she replied, still laughing as the phone clicked.
"You know what Hunter S. Thompson said to do when things get weird?"
The voice behind me was familiar, and though I couldn't identify him on a conscious level, my unconscious reacted with a chill which ran the length and breadth of my body. I turned and looked up to see Mr. Lime. He gestured to the empty chair across from me, and I nodded more out of habit than agreement. I had never seen him ambulatory and was surprised at how tiny he actually was, noting he wasn't much taller standing than I was in a sitting position. He moved like a marionette being operated by a drunken puppeteer, as if each joint was being operated separately and badly. I'd also never seen him in the sunlight, and the early morning glow bouncing off the snow outside made his skin look even more translucent, not unlike the visible man model we used in biology class in high school. Recognizing correctly that I was at a loss for words, he continued his explanation as he lowered himself into his seat.
"Mr. Thompson opined, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. It's an odd expression, but once you hear it, you'll be surprised at the number of applications to which it applies on a day-to-day basis."
I felt my brow began to furrow as I worked on forming a question, but he waved it away with his bony hand, which looked so thin I suspect it didn't even move the air as he passed it in front of me.
"Not to worry, Mr. Marks, I'm not following you. On the contrary, I was on my way to see you this morning. Harpo," he continued, gesturing toward the counter, "stopped into this lovely establishment to purchase some tea to help me stave off the chill, and came back to the car with the happy news that you were already comfortably ensconced within."
I looked over at the queue which had formed at the counter and recognized Mr. Lime's silent henchman, patiently waiting in line, just like anyone off the street. He saw I was looking at him and gave me a subtle tip of his non-existent hat. I turned back to Mr. Lime, who now, for the 4th time in my life, was seated across from me, smiling his skull-like grin from ear to ear. Seeing him there, right out here in public, was wildly disconcerting, like seeing a mermaid sitting poolside at the YMCA, if that mermaid were a scary old psychopath. "You were coming to the store?" I said. Saying the words aloud provided a chill all their own. To the magic store?"
"Yes. I've never seen your establishment and figured by this time you've most likely had the chance to interview the 4 suspects I had suggested to the police. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and am, admittedly, impatient by nature."
Again he smiled, and again it was all I could do to keep from jumping up and running out of the coffee shop, screaming into the snowy morning. It took effort, but I was able to suppress the desire, but at the same time, I made a mental note that it would always provide a good hip pocket option.
"Did you have a chance to meet with them?"
He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, and then intertwined his bony fingers and settled his chin upon them. The look would have been coquettish if he were a 17-year-old high school cheerleader, but the sheer ingenuousness of his pose simply made it all the more dark and frightening.
"Did they prove thought-provoking?"
The question was presented innocently enough, but it was backed by such menace that for a moment I had a sudden fear for each of my interview subjects, sensing one or more could be in some sort of homicidal peril. "Each was thought-provoking in his or her own way," I began, not at all sure where I was headed. I haven't spent much time in the past with extremely wealthy people. Lime clucked his tongue and nodded.
Yes, money does.
He paused, thinking for a long moment.
It does funny things to people, he finally said,
putting a spin on funny, which made it sound anything but. It looked like he had more to say on the topic, but Harpo arrived at this moment, bearing a cardboard cup of tea, which he placed gingerly in front of Mr. Lime. The old man removed his elbows from the table and leaned back as Harpo reached past me for the sweetener options. He found 2 packets of actual sugar and opened them daintily to ensure, I suspected, that no errant crystals found their way to the front of Mr. Lime's well-tailored black overcoat. With the sugar safely deposited in the cup, Harpo produced a stir stick and gave the liquid what appeared to be the standard and regulated number of stirs. He tapped the wet stick on the side of the cup and then stepped away as silently as he had arrived. Mr. Lime reached for the cup with both hands, looking up at me as he did.
"Excuse me," he said, "but I have a bit of a chill."
"Me too," I agreed, and we each raised our respective cups to our lips. He gurgled softly while sipping his tea. For my part, I couldn't take my eyes off his hands. They were clasped tightly around the cardboard cup, and I swear I could actually see the coffee shop logo through his rice paper skin. He swallowed happily, set the cup down, and licked his lips, his tongue darting in and out of his mouth like it was afraid of the sunlight. He smiled up at me and gestured with both hands.
"Proceed," he said. "I'm very anxious to hear about your adventures."
Mr. Lime was remarkably quiet through my recap, nodding encouragingly and offering an occasional "ah" or "oh yes, I see," but otherwise letting me recount the substance of the interviews and my alleged perceptions at my own halting pace. I wrapped up my report, and he looked at me for a long time without expression. Then suddenly, like a dead flower resurrecting back to life, his lips twisted into a smile which quickly spread across his lean and sallow face.
"Excellent," he said,
his voice a hoarse whisper.
"Simply excellent,"
he added, then picked up his tea and took a short sip. "Thank you," I said, from habit. I honestly wasn't sure which part or parts of my story were deserving of this praise.
"Let me ask you this,"
he said, setting down his cup and reaching for a paper napkin from the dispenser. It proved to be recalcitrant, and so I pulled one out from the other side of the dispenser just as Harpo appeared at the table. In his stubby, muscular hands, he held a small pile of napkins, which he had produced seemingly out of thin air. Presented with these choices, Mr. Lime looked from one offering to the other and then took the napkin I was holding. Before he left, Harpo turned and gave me a blank look, which I naturally read as cold and homicidal.
"Let me ask you this,"
Mr. Lime repeated, once he had dabbed away the small amount of moisture from his lips.
"And I'd like you to be completely honest."
"Certainly," I said.
"What does your gut tell you about each of these people and their relationship to the murder of Tyler James and the theft of London after midnight?"
"I don't know about the murder," I began, "but each of them could, I think, have been the buyer of the stolen movie print."
"Expound,"
he said, once again resting his elbows on the table and his chin on his hands. I sat back, considering the 4 suspects. Okay. Obviously, each of them has enough money to make the purchase, which might have been as high as $750,000, if the $75,000 found in the projection booth was just a 10% down payment.
"Agreed," he said with a sharp nod. "However, let us not forget that, on occasion, people take deep, sometimes homicidal pleasure from getting what they've paid for without actually paying for it. To spend the money, but still have the money, as it were.
The miser's dream, I said.
Exactly, he said, his smile getting even wider. And speaking as a miser myself, he continued, that dream never dies.
I wasn't quite sure what to do with this comment, so I turned my attention back to his original question. Clifford Thomas, I began, likes kitschy, macabre things, if his Addams Family house on Summit Avenue is any indication. He writes murder mysteries, and the plot of London After Midnight is, to some degree, a famous murder mystery. He admitted to buying items from Tyler in the past, and spending money like that in what some might consider a foolish manner could be his way at getting back at his more successful ex-wife, I added. If you don't mind a little dime store psychoanalysis.
Not only do I not mind it, I encourage it, Mr. Lime said. And what of our banker friend, the art collector, Mr. Kavanaugh?
He takes great pleasure, perverse pleasure, really, in possessing things he's not supposed to, I said, remembering his white-walled apartment in downtown St. Paul and the treasures hidden behind them. Makes him feel like a bad boy. And I think owning something stolen by the Nazis and hidden by the Swiss, a one-of-a-kind treasure, which everyone thought was long lost, would be right up his alley.
An odd bird, that one,
Mr. Lime said quietly, clearly not recognizing the irony of one odd bird calling out another. He looked back at me.
Think he is our secret buyer?
I had already given this considerable thought, going back and forth on my opinion of his alleged guilt. I shook my head. I don't think so, I said.
Why not?
It's what he said. Chip Kavanaugh likes to look at his stolen treasures, hang them on the walls, and hide them from the world for his own private viewing. I really don't think some old tin movie reels filled with disintegrating celluloid is the sort of thing he'd get excited about, let alone kill for.
Good point. And what of the Ice Queen, Ms. Sherry Lisbon? Was she our mystery buyer?
I took a sip of my now cold coffee as I thought back on our meeting in her office at Bimax. She's a tough one to read, I said.
Indeed.
She doesn't strike me as a passionate movie memorabilia buyer, I continued. In fact, I can't decide what her category would be, if any. She doesn't care what she's buying, as long as she's able to take it away from someone else who wants to buy it.
What does your dime store psychoanalysis suggest to you about her?
That she's a nut job, I said before I realized I was saying it out loud. Mr. Lime chuckled at my assessment.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail squarely on the head with our friend Miss Lisbon.
But they're all nut jobs, really, I said. I don't know if they were nut jobs before they got rich or if the money was the cause, but each of them struck me as strange in their own unique, creepy, and oddball way.
I can say this about that. I started out dirt poor, and money hasn't changed me in the least.
He stared at me straight-faced for a long moment, and then his face erupted into a huge smile.
Gotcha, didn't I?
I had to admit he had. I could tell he was deeply pleased at his momentary ruse.
And what of Randall Glendower? He asked, getting back on topic. Where does he fall on this spectrum?
I couldn't help but smile, thinking of the cheery, rotund comic book store owner with his pet monkey, million-dollar website, and fanatics' love of movies and movie memorabilia. He's the only one who admitted to bidding on buying London After Midnight, and he was outbid.
Did he say by who?
I shook my head. I'm not even sure he knew.
Yet one of our quartet has admitted to taking pleasure in outbidding people on the objects they love, just for the sheer enjoyment of taking it away from them.
I considered this. Sherry Lisbon certainly could be the one who outbid him, I said. But if she was the one who bought the movie from Tyler, She would hardly need to kill him to take possession of it.
Yes. Well, that brings us to the other side of our coin,
Mr. Lime said, sitting back in his chair.
As you say, whoever bought the movie from Tyler would have no need to kill him for it. So we can assume, at least for argument's sake, our killer was not the final buyer. And yet, to date, no one admits to being the buyer, or for that matter, the seller, which brings us back to square one.
He sighed deeply, to such a degree that his shrunken chest appeared to sink even further into his tiny frame. Then his eyes once again brightened, and he clapped his hands together with such force that several other patrons in the quiet coffee shop noticeably started at the sound.
Enough of this,
he said, as his skeleton grin returned to his face.
Do me a trick, and we'll call it a day.
I was still reeling from the sound of his hands clapping, and it took me a moment to register what he was requesting. As soon as I did, I realized he had once again caught me unarmed, magic-wise. I recognized we were a short walk from a store, which was packed, wall to wall, with magic tricks and classic illusions, but I wanted to leave that as a last resort. I had the feeling once Mr. Lime was invited into your home, like a vampire, things would progress quickly from bad to worse. I scanned the room and then our table for inspiration, my gaze settling on the small container of various sweeteners that Harpo had selected from earlier. In an effort to meet Harry's recent challenge to give my current act some well-needed practice while adding to my admittedly limited repertoire, I had been reading up on possible tricks I could quickly slip into my close-up act. There was one with a sugar pack called Very Sweet by an inventive magician named David Gabay, which I had recently read about but had never attempted. As foolish as it was to try out a new trick without any practice, I recognized if I didn't do something, I was likely to raise Mr. Lime's ire, and I certainly didn't want to experience what that might be like. I pulled the sweetener container over, praying Harpo hadn't taken the last of the real sugar packets when he had sweetened Mr. Lime's tea. As luck would have it, there was one more remaining, stuck in amid the pink and yellow packets of artificial options. Like the miser's dream, I began, vamping like crazy while I ran the steps of the illusion through my mind. Everybody likes the idea of spending their money while still keeping it. It's basic human nature. Mr. Lime nodded in silent agreement as I held up the sugar packet. Now, let's say you want this sugar packet, and it costs $0.25, and all you have is $0.25, and you'd rather not give up your last quarter, but what are you going to do? Because you really want the sugar. I was nearly out of breath as my run-on sentence finally found some desperately needed punctuation. Do you have $0.25? I continued. Mr. Lime stared back at me as if I had suddenly begun speaking Mandarin. I repeated the question in a shorter form. $0.25.
Oh, dear,
he said, looking for the first time since I'd met him, perplexed and perhaps even a little lost.
I don't carry money. Haven't in years. $0.25, you say?
He began to pat his pockets, but we both knew how that was going to end. To take him out of his misery, I quickly produced a coin from my pocket. Not a problem, I said with a hollow laugh. You can use mine. I slid the coin across the table toward him. He picked it up and examined it with great interest, like an archaeologist who had discovered a relic from a lost civilization. While he scrutinized both sides of the rare treasure I'd given him, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my ever-present black Sharpie pen. I uncapped it and held it out for him. To make sure I don't switch the coin in the process of the trick, why don't you go ahead and put your initials on the coin? Once again, he gave me a blank, pained look.
Sign the coin,
he said in a whisper. Just your initials, I said, again pushing the pen toward him.
Sorry to disappoint you, Mr. Marks, he said, regaining his voice, but I don't sign things. Anything. Ever.
While I've certainly had audience members who were too drunk to sign their initials, this was a first for me. I glanced over at Harpo, who was seated straight back in a chair by the window, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was staring at us, unblinkingly. I had the feeling he had been doing this the entire time. "And I'm guessing your pal Harpo doesn't go around signing things either," I said, trying to put a jovial spin on my tone. Mr. Lime smiled ruefully as he gave his head a simple shake. "How about I put my initials on it?" I suggested, pulling back both the pen and the coin and trying to jumpstart the trick back to life. I mean, if the magician puts his own initials on the coin, that does weaken the credibility of the trick somewhat, but we're all friends here, right? This last thought made Mr. Lime widen his smile, showing off his pointed and yellowed teeth.
"Friends, that we are, Mr. Marks, that we are."
I fought the chill this statement sent throughout my body by refocusing my attention on the coin, the pen, and my somewhat shaky initials. Then I capped the pen and picked up the coin. "In order to obtain the sugar," I said, using the coin to gesture toward the packet on the table, "we're forced to give up the coin." With that, I tossed the coin from one hand to the other and then opened the hand to show the coin was gone. I opened the other hand as well, which appeared to be equally empty. This produced a delighted coo from Mr. Lime. I didn't take any time to bask in it, but charged forward. "We may have lost the coin, but we now possess the sugar," I said, picking the packet up from its place on the table. "But wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we could have both the sugar and—" I tore the top off the packet and handed it to Mr. Lime. He took it gingerly with 2 fingers and, noting my gesture, turned the packet upside down. A flow of white crystals streamed out onto the tabletop, along with the resounding clink of the quarter.
"And the coin,"
Mr. Lime said, completing my sentence. His bony finger separated the grains of sugar on the table, revealing the signed coin within. He gently picked it up and looked closely at the initials, a look of wonder on his face. "If you'd like," I said, brushing the pile of sugar into my hand, "you can keep the quarter as a souvenir."
"Oh, that would be wonderful,"
he said, not taking his eyes off the sticky, pen-stained coin.
"Just wonderful."
I will say this about the odd Mr. Lime. He was undoubtedly a criminal. He was likely a murderer, perhaps on multiple occasions. But when things went right, he was also the best audience I'd ever had for magic. I followed Mr. Lime and Harpo out to their car. It was parked boldly in a no-parking zone, yet bore no sign of a ticket. The old man clutched Harpo's arm as they navigated to the car's back door. I found myself extending an arm of my own to ensure the fragile marionette made it into the back seat unscathed. Once safely deposited, he looked up at me, squinting in the sunlight reflecting off the snow. As always, his pupils were deep black, even as his eyes narrowed in the bright light.
"Thank you, Mr. Marks, for your insights," he said. "And, of course, for your magic. I'm afraid I've grown tired. We'll save our visit to your shop for another day."
"Looking forward to it," I lied.
"And you, take care of yourself,"
he continued, as Harpo stood by patiently with one hand on the door handle, waiting to close the door and get on their way.
"After your close call with the stolen car the other night, I would hate to lose you to a simple hit-and-run accident."
"You and me both."
"Yes,"
he agreed with an enigmatic smile.
"Any other accidents I should know about?"
I was about to say no, but a thought occurred to me. Actually, there was another accident. He looked up at me with great interest, so I continued. "Tracy, the manager of the movie theater, fell off a ladder in front of the theater. Someone pushed it. No one saw who it was.
And was this Tracy injured?
She cracked her head pretty badly, but she's okay, I said, remembering the frozen pool of blood on the sidewalk in front of the theater.
That raises many questions for our consideration, but one in particular,
he said, leaning back and settling into the leather seat.
What do you and this Tracy have in common?
I thought the question sounded rhetorical, and Harpo must have agreed, for he shut the door to the dark sedan, and the car disappeared down 48th Street. But I didn't really notice, because I was considering what Tracy and I had in common. I had considered it before and had no trouble bringing it back to the surface. It was this. We had both looked into the projection booth and witnessed the details, such as they were, of the Tyler James crime scene.